All right, there we go. Well, welcome. Uh, so I think that what I have planned for us today might, uh, well, going back to our prior conversation, might be a bit inspiring from the standpoint of its importance. I think actually looking back on this particular lesson, you might find it to be one of the most important ones. Even if you aren't able to tie all of the pieces together during this one, I think it's going to hold a lot for you for the future. And um, to give you a bit more of a location about where this work comes from. The reason why that's important to me is because if you don't know the history, if you don't know where the work comes from, where these ideas and the philosophy and these sorts of things come from, um, you've kind of lost your connection to the source of it. Right? We've talked about this exoteric, mesoteric, and esoteric aspects to the work. And if you take the esoteric aspect out, or you don't know what's at the core of it, then you're just left with two-thirds, right, of what it is, and it becomes more of a philosophy or a theory, or I guess in some cases, excuse me, I'm cough by the way, in some cases even a bit of a pastime, right? So um, what I would like to do today is to give a bit of a foundation as regarding what underlies this work and what its origins are. Um, I suppose in fairly recent history, you could start with a man named Gurdjieff, George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. And he was a Greek Armenian philosopher born in 1866 or 67, they're not quite sure, and died in October of 1949. And his basic premise um, was that people are asleep and they are in this kind of state of consciousness. All of humanity is primarily in this state of consciousness where it would be called something like waking sleep. You think you're awake, but you're not fully aware of the present and fully conscious and fully invested and involved in it. Um, he is not the one, to my knowledge anyway, he is not the one that coined the term fourth way. I think that was actually one of his students by the name of Ouspensky that said that. But he did talk about four different ways. He talked about basically the way of the body, right? You find some religions that are very physical based, or I should say some spiritual paths that are very physically based. You can take examples of certain types of yoga, or even martial arts as an example of that. You have others which are very much emotionally based, and those are having to do with things like deep feelings of devotion and that connection, prayer, this very heartfelt approach to spirituality. And then you have the way of the mind, right, which would be the third way. And examples of that can include things like meditation, uh, or memorization, right? In the East, they have folks who can recite tens of thousands of pages of sutras, from start to finish. Go through I mean, that takes an incredible amount of thinking capacity, to be able to do that, to memorize that kind of thing. Um, and so those are the three standard ways that he talked about. And almost every religion, or sometimes within a religion, you'll find people that have certain inclinations towards different aspects to it. But in a general way, most spiritual practices can be broken down based on one of those three. And the person is attracted to the type that best suits them. Philosophers. If you're a mentally kind of ambitious person, you might like debate and philosophy and logics and those types of things, logical arguments. I suppose you could even put something like atheism in a category of spiritual belief that tends to be very thought based. So what Gurdjieff came to talk about was what he called the way of the sly man. Okay, and it also later became known as the fourth way. And the fourth way, or the way of the sly man, basically takes all three of those aspects of spiritual practices and disciplines. And instead of having a person, join one school where they fully develop their mental capacity, and then they graduate that school and they move on to a second one where they um, work on their emotional life, and then a third one where they work on their physical. The fourth way, or the way of the sly man, saves time by combining all of those together, all simultaneously. And so, in a discipline such as this, you don't do it linearly. You do it simultaneously. Yeah, and that's the idea behind the fourth way. Gurdjieff wrote several books. One is called Meetings with Remarkable Men. Another is called um, Life is Real Only Then When I Am. And another one's called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. And within those books, let me tell you something a little bit about Gurdjieff. Whenever he would write, he tried to do something that he liked to call burying the dog. Okay, now there's an expression in certain cultures where you bury the bone. The bone being, something secret, something hidden. Well, Gurdjieff wanted to go one step further, and instead of burying just the bone, he would bury the entire dog along with the bone. Okay, so in other words, what he was saying is that he was very obscure with with things, and so when and if you read some of his works, you have to do so very slowly and very carefully, because if you just do a certain kind of surface reading of the material, you might think, "Ah, what a fantastic story," and completely miss all of the undertones, all of the currents running through it that are there, and some of them are just incredibly profound. Might do some exploration into those types of things at some points here soon. But uh, one of the things that he brought up, or in one of the passages, he relates a story of he and a friend of his named Pagosian, I think it was, that were exploring around the city of Ani. Okay, and Ani is a city between the Turkish and Armenian border. All right, it used to be called the city of 1,001 churches because it had a huge population of churches there. But underneath, they discovered that there was like a dip in the soil, and they began to dig, and they went in and they found this underground network, this cave system, where people obviously had lived, and they came across a certain manuscript, which he called Merhabat, and within that was a society known as the Sarmang Brotherhood. And that excited them because they had heard legends of the Sarmang Brotherhood, and it was something that had apparently started back around 2500 BC in and around the area of Babylon and Mesopotamian area. And they were said to possess a great deal of spiritual knowledge. And were kind of the keepers of esoteric knowledge. And they had migrated from place to place, obviously touching Egypt, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it set Gurdjieff on this symbolic mission to discover the Sarmang Brotherhood and what they could mean, what that might be. Now, if you Google the Sarmang Brotherhood and come across, I think the first entry is a Wikipedia page, you'll find that there is so much speculation regarding that. One author, I think it's J.G. Bennett, claims that it is an offshoot of Zoroastrianism, and attributes a couple of meanings to the word sarmang, one of which is those who have purified their head, right? And another one having to do something with bees. The reason I find that a bit hard to believe is because you can tell that he didn't realize that Old Persian and Farsi is read from right to left. And if you read the word Sarmang from left to right, you come up with Mansar, which is basically like Keeper of the Bees, but he didn't understand. He was reading it in the wrong direction, you see. And so that one's a bit out for me. I have done the research into that to see if there's any way to substantiate it. Um, Another theory out there is that the Sarmang was a Sufi order in the Naqshbandi order, or Naqshbandi umbrella, right, of esoteric Islam, of Sufism. Pretty much no expert on Sufism agrees because they've, the ones who have read the various tales about what happens in the Sarmang Brotherhood and all this type of thing have all said it doesn't sound much like Sufism to me. You know, so that one's a bit hard for me personally to believe as well. A third common idea out there is that it's a Tibetan order or a Buddhist Tibetan brotherhood. Um, and I can see where they get that because there is still one today called something very similar. It's more has a like a TS sound like Sarmang, okay, but similar name, yeah. And you can see that. But again, you get these sorts of teachings and philosophies and ideas and concepts that you just don't find anywhere in Buddhism, right? In Theravada, I guess that would be the school of Buddhism in Tibet, generally speaking. So it's another miss. And frankly, this is something that has puzzled me for decades. And the first time I read the word Sarmang, I too wanted to know, what is this? What is this Sarmang Brotherhood? And I followed all the theories that were out there and became dissatisfied with all of them. And then in a moment of, I guess you would say, inspired research, research-backed inspiration, if you will, I think I discovered what Sarmang actually means, and it's an instance of Gurdjieff burying the dog along with the bone. One of the things that Gurdjieff loved to do was to come up with what are called neologisms, okay, new words. That's what they're generally called. Examples of those is instead of saying something simple and easy to understand, like the law of seven, like we do, he would call it heptapara pershenok, right? Or the law of three was something along the lines of tria kamna zeno, or like something like that. And what he would do is he was very fluent in many languages, and he would take root words of different languages and just kind of crush them all together to come up with a new word. And his writings are replete with such things, and it makes the reader slow down for one, so it has a very useful benefit. But also, it's examples of burying the dog. If you take apart the word heptapara, for example, you find, I think, 3 languages in there, and hepta, obviously meaning 7 in I think it's Greek actually, is part of that. It's what he called the law of 7. Okay, so you with me so far? Complicated guy and very difficult to read. If you especially Beelzebub's tales to his grandson is a massive undertaking. If you try to muddle through that, and he also recommends that you read it 3 different times. But my inspired discovery was I said was a Greek Armenian Greek, whatever. And that perhaps Sarmang comes from a combination, one of his neologisms, of his 2 primary languages, that being Armenian and Greek. And what I discovered was something very interesting. Sar in Armenian means mountain, and moon or moni in Greek, Sarmong, means monastery. So you have mountain monastery, perhaps. And so then I started to look for any kind of evidence of, well, okay, what would a mountain monastery mean in this context? And I wrote down a couple of quotes that I would just like to read you because I can't get them exactly so. These are some statements by Gurdjieff himself. One time he was asked what the origin of his teachings were. And this is what he had to say. He said, I don't know what you know about Christianity. It would be necessary to talk a great deal and to talk for a long time in order to make clear what you understand by this term. But for the benefit of those who know already, I will say that, if you like, this is esoteric Christianity. So there's one. On another occasion, he said, yes, my dear friend, if only the teaching of the divine Jesus Christ were carried out in full conformity with its original, then the religion, unprecedentedly wisely founded on it, would not only be the best of all existing religions, but even of all religions which may arise and exist in the future. And on another occasion, he said, prehistoric Egypt was Christian many thousands of years before the birth of Christ. That is to say, this religion was composed of the same principles and ideas that constitute true Christianity. And then finally, on his deathbed, he instructed his closest students to make contact with the inner tradition on Mount Athos. And that's when the bells went off, right? Ah, Mount Athos, because, pardon me, I don't know if you know about Mount Athos, but they don't let ladies there, right? It's a monastery, or I should say a grouping of monasteries with a very rich and long tradition. And one of the traditions is that Mary Magdalene sailed there after Jesus' death, and in honor of her, she's the only female to ever have set foot on that soil again. And so, even to this day, if you're a gent, you can get a tour of Mount Athos, and if you're a lady, you just have to ask the gent what it was like. Right, but that would seem to tie in pretty closely with everything that Gurdjieff had said about Sarmong and the Sarmong Brotherhood, especially his fairly direct statement where the dog is not buried at all, of go make contact with the inner tradition on Mount Athos. Okay, so this is my assertion. I've never seen it written or published anywhere else, but I'm fairly confident that it stands a pretty rigid test that that's what Gurdjieff actually meant. And he would have been raised in the area, being Greek Armenian, being exposed to the Eastern Orthodox. I won't just say Greek Orthodox, but the Eastern Orthodox traditions, which include the Russian Church and whatnot. So then, going back to the first statement I read, I hope you caught that one little bit in there. For those who know already, he said, for the benefit of those who know already, this is esoteric Christianity. That begs the question of, who he was talking about that might already know that. I would think that maybe another not so deeply buried dog. He said that he traveled with several companions, 12 to be exact. He had 12 companions on this quest to discover the fourth way. Now, if that's the case, it does beg the question of why be so obsequious about it, right? Why be so? Why would you hide this? And you have to think about the era that Gurdjieff showed up. It's between 1867 and onward through the era of 1914. It's just on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, where people were really running away from religion in many respects almost as quickly as they could. Science became the new religion. And it was becoming less and less vogue and popular to just hold your Bible and read from the Bible and try and convert people. And and so in order to get his message across, what Gurdjieff wanted to do was to couch it in scientific terms. And so when you read anything about Gurdjieff or Ouspensky's writing, which was one of his students, you'll find so many references to like chemical terms. He uses the term hydrogen, not in the same way we do. He uses carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. He uses very mathematical things like the Enneagram, which is, the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1. The ideas of time and space and scale and things relating to one another. It was almost like all of these esoteric concepts. We'll get to where they come from in a minute, but all these esoteric concepts that sit allegedly at the core of Christianity, in other words, not the outward trappings of it, but the core of it, had to be rebranded in a certain way so that they would be kind of more palatable, if you will, to the mindset of the time. And he was quite successful. Many famous people who eventually became famous were heavily influenced by Gurdjieff's teachings without ever even knowing where it came from, right? But it was it was new, different. No one had ever heard anything like it, and at least so they thought. Yeah. So you with me so far? Kind of a bit of a contextual history about it, and of course, the Eamon and Eminent Way are derived largely in part from Fourth Way philosophy. There's other things that have been mixed into it, but it's a bit off topic right now. So let's follow this thread a little bit deeper. Okay. In the passage where he says that prehistoric Egypt was Christian many centuries before Christianity, I think that gives us another clue of where to look. And so if you begin to explore Egypt for the origins, you come across some pretty interesting things, especially during the Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the First dynasty. Ptolemy was, I should say, Ptolemy Soter, the first one, was very open to religions and philosophies. He conquered Egypt, but let Egypt be Egypt, if you will. And one of the things that came out of Egypt, or that was alleged to have come out of Egypt, according to like Pythagoras and whatnot, is alchemy. In fact, the word alchemy literally is an Arabic word just meaning the black land, because Egypt was known as Kemet in the day. Okay, and so alchemy is the art of the people of Egypt, or the art of black land. And the interesting thing is, all throughout Pharaonic Egypt, or what's called Pharaonic Egypt, the religion hadn't changed at all for thousands of years. The only two times that it changed was when Christianity got superimposed upon it, and then later around, I think it was 700 something AD, Islam. Those are the only two times. Now, if you have a very powerful belief system, and we'll call it alchemy, even though we don't know what alchemy is just yet, you have a very powerful belief system. You have a very powerful theurgic in many respects. They believed in magic and the ability to manipulate natural laws, all of these sorts of things. And you're in an environment where something is being imposed upon you, like Christianity. Well, there's two options. Either A, you fight against it, and you begin to have a war against the new incoming religion, or B, you absorb yourself into it. The path of least resistance. Now, it would be a very alchemical attitude, which we'll get to, but a very alchemical attitude to do the latter, to absorb yourself into it rather than try to fight against it. And, there is no evidence that there was a war between the Osirians, or the Osirian religion, and Christianity. It just kind of disappeared. Right. And so it suggests the latter. They just they said, this is an interesting, nice new belief. There's a lot of things about this religion that mesh quite well with the principles and the symbology of alchemy. This whole idea of, resurrection, which is a very Osirian idea. Osiris was resurrected, and many different aspects or elements of it. And so the hunch that I followed was that that's what happened to alchemy. that it just kind of, went inside and became what I would call the esoteric core of Christianity. Now, Christianity is a strange religion because despite what you might think, it didn't really have a date of origin. It kind of developed over time. And people can get into theological debates regarding, well, it had its birth with Christ, but there's a lot of controversy that perhaps that gent didn't exist in actuality, that it was more symbolic. None of that's really that relevant at this point in time, but it is important to keep in mind that it was an evolving philosophy, and I don't think it really settled until about 500-ish AD when they canonized and said, okay, this is the Bible. Here you go, right? Sort of thing. Most of the Gospels were written 80 to 100 years or more after, Jesus' supposed death and whatnot. So it's important that to understand that it was a malleable thing at that point in time. It wasn't like a fixed religion. Yeah. Buddhism was a very fixed religion. Buddha, poof, enlightened under the tree. He said, this is Buddhism. Here you go. Right? I mean, everything evolves over time, but it was much more formalized. Yeah. So where do we go from Alexandria, Egypt, which was kind of this melting pot of different philosophies? Well, if you take the idea of esoteric Christianity, or I should say alchemy, of sort of imbuing itself into the inner echelons of the philosophy of Christianity, you have to start to look at some of the early writings of the time. And one of the earliest ones, or I should say collection of writings that was started by what were called the Desert Fathers, is the Philokalia. And I think there's even PDF versions available. In fact, I think I have a PDF version. If you're interested, I'll send it to you. I think it's about 6,000 pages, so it's not a quick, easy read. But I've done so, and to my surprise, almost everything that I've ever encountered, actually everything that I've ever encountered in the Fourth Way, as far as disciplines and ideas, meditations, practices, all of these types of things are actually contained in the Philokalia, which became, outside of the Bible, became kind of the root doctrines or principles of how a monastic society such as that on Mount Athos is meant to go on. And when you stumble across something, right, it's one thing to have a theory, and it's another thing to have a theory that every time you look in a new direction to try to see if you can combat the theory, more pieces of the puzzle begin to fall into place. Yeah, and the Philokalia is another great example of this, because it's like I said, one of the source doctrines or documents for what is practiced at Mount Athos. And just scan through it. You don't have to read all 7,000 pages, whatever it is. It's in 5 volumes. But have a scan through it, and tell me if I'm wrong, because you'll find some of these ideas, and they're very much similar to Fourth Way ideas. Not even similar; they're like exactly the same. So have a look for yourself. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think that is where Gurdjieff was coming from, and that somewhere in his life he was exposed to the inner teachings. He was in the right place at the right time and had the right constitution or construction to be able to handle some of these teachings. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he was probably trained and sent forth into the world to reseed this kind of doctrine, this kind of information. I would like to go over, if you're willing, a couple other bits of evidence, and then I'm just going to sit back and we can have a chat about it. Okay? Sound all right?
Yeah.
So in the Fourth Way philosophy, there are 7 levels of man. stages, okay, that a person is. And he just calls them man number 1 through man number 7. Um, I've got it on the board, but I'll walk up to it in a minute. Man number 1 is primarily controlled by his moving center, right? You know the type, they're physical. They approach life in a physical way. You know? Man number 2, primarily by his emotional center, approaches life in an emotional way. It's the first way in that he feels life. And man number 3 thinks life. So those are the first 3. Man number 4, pardon me, has what is called a permanent center of gravity. This is where we talk about the 4th way, where instead of doing all the work of man number 1, then number 2, then number 3, the 4th way is combining all of those simultaneously. And you end up developing a permanent center of gravity. Gurdjieff also said no one's born that way, right? Everyone is born as number 1, 2, or 3, and it takes work to get to be number 4. Man number 5 is crystallized. In other words, they have worked on themselves, they've worked on their centers, they have not just having a permanent center of gravity, but actually having something congeal or crystallize within them, a new life, if you will. Man number 6 is almost complete, but is kind of still in a process of development. And we'll get to kind of what it looks like in a little bit here. And then man number 7 is the highest level of development that a human can hope to achieve, according to the 4th way system. All right, now let's talk a little bit about alchemy, because there are a couple different versions of it. If you take alchemy around the 11th, 12th centuries, then you start to, get all of these writings, these mysterious hermetic writings talking about things like turning lead into gold, or the interaction of sulfur and salt and mercury and air and earth and water and fire and niter and ammonia, and it's just like goes on and on and on. And they come up with all of these elaborate laboratory processes, which ultimately became what we know as chemistry today, right? We have the ancient alchemists who were experimenting with the laws of nature to thank for that. But the thing that chemistry lacks today, in my opinion, is that it's more focused and geared towards commercial product, right? You're trying to make a medicine, you're trying to make a better plastic, you're trying to make a fuel, all of these things. It's very practical, and it makes our life, what's the saying, better living through chemistry, I think was one of the early sayings of it. Whereas alchemy had a bit of a different goal in mind. The idea behind alchemy was the perfection of something. This idea that you take something as it is and you apply a certain conscious process to it and a certain knowledge of the fundamental laws of creation, and you refine it into something else. And this is the idea of turning lead into gold, which, by the way, science can now do. It's ungodly expensive and not worth it. But by bombarding lead with a certain kind of radiation, you can change it into gold. So I guess they were right after all, that it is actually possible. It's just a couple of atoms off. So you've heard me probably talk about things like hydrogens and carbon and oxygen and nitrogen in a 4th way context in the past. And really what those are the alchemical aspects of things. Hydrogen is fire, nitrogen is air, oxygen is water, and carbon is earth. Right? You can also talk about the 4 scientific states: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. You see, it's the same thing, just recouched in different terms, and that's what Gurdjieff did, in my estimation of it. In alchemy, you have there are 7 distinct processes of transforming. And understand that they weren't just on a journey to try and turn lead into gold or turn plants into medicinals. They were also in an inner process of trying to change themselves, to elevate themselves, to transform themselves into something greater, something higher, something more spiritual. And so as an alchemist would sit and do their physical experiments, they would also be in a state of meditation, watching these transformations take place and taking those transformations into themselves and causing a kind of a meditative awareness of what these physical processes are. Because you got to consider, I mean, if the natural laws are natural laws, they should apply to humans as well as metals and organic life and compounds and everything else. You can't be outside of the laws. If it's a law, it's a law. So this idea of transforming in oneself um, is very much substantiated in the context of a more of a psychological way, which is what the fourth way follows. I did jot down on the board a couple things. I'll actually try to move over there and see if the camera will follow me gently because it doesn't like to. And can you see the board?
Yeah.
Does it come through okay? All right.
Yeah, it's all right. We can.
Yeah. So I'll take a snapshot of this and put it on the side, okay? But the 7 stages in alchemy are calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation. And if you consider each of these that Gurdjieff talked about with the moving center, emotional thinking, permanent center of gravity, crystallization, near completion, and fully developed, there is a one-to-one correlation between these 7 classical stages in alchemy. I'll give you a couple of examples. Calcination. Calcination in alchemy is where you take something, you grind it down, like take a plant, right? You grind it down and you heat it until the point when when the only thing left over is white ash. Okay, they call it the black phase because it starts off burning and charred. When it comes to moving center, you can see a direct analogy of what we do is we apply the fire of our consciousness to fight against our habits, our habitual life. And what we're left over is kind of what's essential out of the moving center life, right? Whereas before it had things that are not necessarily needed in it. After applying that fire and energy of consciousness to it and really burning it, working it, reduced to something a bit more essential in the moving center. The next phase is dissolution, and this would correspond to the emotional center. Dissolution is when you take that white ash and you dissolve it in water. You let it mix in with the water, and what happens is the heavy sediments kind of fall out, and anything that's water soluble stays inside the water. Okay, now this has to do with the emotional center from the standpoint of taking all of the good habits that you've acquired through work on the moving center, allowing them to interact with your emotional life to be able to cause this kind of filtration, or not filtration, but this separation of what's essentially you, right? We've talked about essence and personality. This is that separation of essence and personality using emotional techniques. Some of the techniques in the fourth way are to avoid expressing negative emotions. You see that causes this kind of saturation. We talk about crystallization and supersaturated solutions and all these sorts of things, but that's what dissolution is. The third one, having to do with the thinking center, is separation. And what they do in an alchemical sense is they actually take that sludge, that water, with the ash in it, and they run it through a filter, and whatever is solid stays behind, and whatever is liquid or water soluble comes through that filter. And so then what you have is this water containing the various salts. We talked about the way the thinking center works many times. That it has this separating out, this compare and contrast aspect to it. So you can see how the thinking center works with that. Now we get into this is the kind of the first 3 automatic. The fourth one, the permanent center of gravity, has to do with conjunction. This is where, or what's called conjunction, this is where the alchemist takes all of the things that they've purified out, right? All of these different aspects that they've purified out through fire, through water, through evaporation, these sorts of methods. and they combine them back together. They've created something permanent at that point in time, exactly as Gurdjieff talks about. Fermentation is what Gurdjieff calls crystallization. Now, where this gets interesting is because at that fifth stage of personal development, an outside influence needs to be present. And it's exactly the same. Like you need to be connected to something esoteric, for example. Or if you've had the lesson on the A, B, and C influences, you need to be connected to that C influence. In fermentation, two things happen. First, the plant life rots, okay, it begins to decay. And in scripture, you get these ideas of being born again, or, you must first die in order to be born again, that sort of thing. Same thing is being talked about here. So at stage 5, decay begins to happen. But then it begins to ferment, and you get this, rats, what are they called? Yeast. Yeast goes through and eats the sugars and excretes alcohol, all right? And so you get this fermentation process happening. And it becomes an alcoholic beverage at that point, kind of. I wouldn't drink it, but that's the idea. You see, yeast is an outside influence, though, coming in to cause this kind of bubbling up. At the next stage, near completion, you have what's called distillation. Distillation is where, in the example of spagyrics, which is the creation of medicine and whatnot, where you boil things off at different intervals. You boil off the alcohols, okay? You boil off the essential oils, for example. I just recently made some spearmint oil and also oregano oil, and using this process because I like to get my hands on it and actually do things that we talk about. Yeah? But distillation is that process. It's almost complete. You've separated out all of the essential things, the salts, the oils, the various components that you're trying to elevate and perfect. And then finally, fully developed, the alchemists called coagulation. Another term for that is the philosopher's stone. They would take these separate things that they had elevated and refined, recombine them back together into something that was originally a plant or a metal or whatever they were refining. And it is now has all of the essential qualities of it, but they've all been uplifted, energized, perfected. Yeah. So again, going back to the evidence that it's the same thing. It is the idea of alchemy, just branded in a particular way. And the reason why this is important to me, I'll sit back down for a moment, is because there are so many mysteries in the fourth way. It's so difficult to read some of these things, especially by people who learned from Gurdjieff, and then by the people who learned from the person who learned from Gurdjieff, and then by the people who learn from the person who learned from the person who learned from Gurdjieff. It begins to become so abstract that I don't think anyone really today in the fourth way knows what the heck they're doing, honestly, or very few people probably do, because it's lost its origins. It doesn't have its roots anymore. And so discovering the roots, you go through now and you read the Philokalia or some of the early alchemical works, from the 11th, 12th centuries. If you can get your hands on some of the very ancient texts that they've discovered in Sumeria and Egypt, you can begin to piece together what some of these obscure references are. For example, Gurdjieff never told anybody what the second conscious shock was. The first one is self-remembering. That's in all of his books. The second one, no one knows, right? But if you study alchemy, you will know. You can know, because someone else did talk about it. Yeah, this is just the origins of it. I don't think Gurdjieff completed his mission. In wrapping up my very long and drawn out spiel, I want to show you one more thing on the board, which will help provide a bit of a cross-reference if you do decide to study some of the fourth way concepts in Gurdjieff's works and study alchemy side by side with it. Then you'll probably be able to use this as a bit of a translation or a dictionary or a reference. All right. So Can you see, does it follow me? Yeah. Can you see this board here? I'll take a screenshot of it. At the top of it, and this may look actually quite similar to the one we did on the I Ching. It's the exact same diagram, just with different words, put into it. But you've got prima materia, which is like the original matter. In the I Ching, it would have been the Tao. And then you've got the principles of fixed and volatile. And these three form a triangle, which Gurdjieff refers to as positive, negative, and neutral. You're familiar with those terms from the work we do. Out of that, out of the fixed side, you get earth and water. And out of the volatile side, you get air and fire. And in Gurdjieff's terminology, earth would be carbon, water would be oxygen, nitrogen would be air, and fire would be hydrogen. Now, you'll get puzzled by something because you'll start to think about this and you'll be like, well, wait a minute. Oxygen coming from water. Well, yes, it is composed of H2O, so there is oxygen in it. But it's associated with the water sign. You might get kind of confused on that. Just remember that for 3 out of 4 of these, they say gen at the end, meaning it creates it, not that it is it. Okay, so hydrogen literally means water maker, but it's associated with fire. What it is in itself is the element of fire. When it expends itself or goes through an alchemical transmutation, it then becomes water. So just keep that in mind, okay? And then out of the fixed side, when you mix earth and water together, you get salt. This is what the alchemists called it. In Gurdjieff's terminology, it's called the body, the physical complex, the even complex. All right. When you mix air and fire together, you get what the alchemists call sulfur. And in Gurdjieff's terminology, that would be one soul. Okay, we talked about this in the context of essence and personality. And when you mix water and air together, you get mercury. Mercury being the spirit. So those are the kind of the 3 main products that come out of those: body, soul, and spirit, or the organism that you're given in your own alchemical laboratory to be able to perfect those things. If you're talking about the alchemy, the chemical alchemy of like making medicinals, for example, then salt would be the body of the plant itself. The mercury would be the alcohol that's produced because it's the same. So in other words, it's like the spirit of the plant. It's the same for every plant. It's ethanol. No matter what you ferment, it's always ethanol. And then the sulfur would be the soul, which is unique to the plant itself. That would be the essential oil of the plant. So there's a big long run of a weave trying to tie things in. And what I'm really hoping to accomplish is not to teach anything necessarily, but to inspire new lines of research so that you can make better heads and tails of some of the things that you're encountering in this work and get a better sense of where it comes from. Yeah, all right. I'll pause for a moment. I know it's a lot to take in. I don't expect you to go, oh yeah, I got all that. But understand that this is backed by, a 20 plus year journey of mine trying to figure out where in the heck this came from, because I don't think anybody or very few people know. What is it causing you?
I'm a little it's the right word here, suspicious, I guess. It's like how does it's like how is there so much commonality between the fourth way and some of the I Ching concepts? And I mean, it's just, so where's so I'm not trying to say poo-poo any of this. This is all fantastic work. It's very detailed work, but it's like, is that it? Like, have we figured it out? Is my question. Like, it makes me feel suspicious.
Yeah, I got you.
It can be. It's
it
like,
can't be that simple.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. Like, how can it be? I understand it's not simple. I understand it's very complex. A lot of people have spent a lot of time, but it just makes me such because like, it can't be that simple. How can it be? Is it? There's got to be more complicated, right? There's be that's what kind of comes to my
This
head saying like,
this thing on the on your left that I wrote on the board that looks so much like that I Ching diagram, right? Where we had the Tao, the greater and lesser yin and yangs. I mean, it is the same
yeah,
symbol. This is definitely, you can look in books on ancient manuscripts on alchemy. They draw the same diagram and they do the same thing in the I Ching. So that's not coming from me. I'm just copying it down from a
no,
manuscript.
yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. Like I
Yeah,
Ching, and this is what I would call sort of I Ching is more Oriental, right? And this is I would call this is more sort of Middle Eastern, Persian, Mesopotamian. That's
Western,
like
sure.
1,000 miles to the west,
Yeah.
right? I don't know if it's 1,000 miles. Maybe it's 3,000 miles. But like, how did they come? Millennia apart. How did they
Give the
come up with the same
understanding.
thing?
Yes.
Like, how does like, this is like some of this is 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old. Like the I Ching is I don't know how old. I don't know if it's the same time frame or is it more recent or even older.
5,000 roughly.
How did they come up
5,000.
with the same thing? That's what that, or is it the same guy went, or is it coming from the same thing? And somebody at some point did some work
Well,
and it.
I'll take it a step further because it puzzled me for a long time about how in the world China could have come up with alchemy independently. And if you read the Chinese, alchemical texts, the translations of them, it sounds just like one of the ones from Western, from Egypt and Sumeria, and even the 1200s, and they had supposedly had no interaction, right? But there have been some recent compelling studies to indicate that the Chinese civilization actually originated in Egypt. There's one very compelling one having to do with the founding of the Chinese civilization, um, where they talk about the Yangtze River running. I have this might have this backwards, but east and west. And there's only one river in the world that runs east and west, and that's the Nile, not the Yangtze River. So that's kind of a bit anecdotal, but it's, if they're talking about something factual, then they can only be talking about one river. They've done genetic studies that indicate that the Chinese civilization may have come from Egypt, and they've also done studies on the hieroglyphs, comparing them to the Chinese written characters. So there's one possible explanation. I'm not saying that is it, but given all of that plus the idea of the same philosophies coming from coming together so nicely, it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, I mean, uh, this sounds very much like there's got to be a deeper or older root,
Yeah.
and at this point it's obscured for whatever reason, or at least I haven't spent the time. I'm not an archaeologist. I have no interest in
Well,
being an
that's
archaeologist,
true.
but
And yet, can you come to this, right? Just by studying. Like the alchemists came up with alchemy, and we thus came up with chemistry based on their discovery of actual natural laws, right? I mean, you mix certain things together, you mix sulfur and iron together, you're going to get iron sulfide, right? You mix certain things, they're following natural laws. And so you can say that this goes beyond philosophy and begins to approach something that's a bit more natural from that standpoint. Two people with the same capacity and the same equipment can make the same observation if it's based in natural law.
well, I mean, I would hesitate that I have the same capacity. I mean, it's not. I don't know if it's two very very what's the right word? Committed, enlightened, dedicated people. I mean, I'm saying it's people. It might not have been people. It might have been a civilization, like a very
Well,
dedicated setup, a monastery, where a group of like we have something like this in Kashmir in India, where there was Kashyap's, and this is also supposed to be 5,000 to 6,000 years old.
yeah,
But I haven't seen anything like, or I haven't done the study if anything like this exists in like the Vedas. There's five Vedas, like five books of Hindu philosophy, because it's not religion; it's kind of way of life. I haven't
yes.
read any of them. and I don't know what they need, and I too lazy to do it. But so there's where, how did they come up with the same thing roughly? And is that because they were early, or is that because that's the fundamental laws that those are the laws, and then that's doesn't matter where and who and how you're gonna bang your head against the wall for 30 years. I went and lived in a monastery. That this is what you're gonna find. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, if that's it, then that's perfect. That's great. Thank you for banging your head against the wall. Thank you very much. Saves me banging my head against the wall. I'll just tell you this. That's it. That's good. I'm all set. So
Well, this is good, Sachin, because it's, a good discussion like this raises more questions than it answers, and hopefully it inspires you to think more about it, and maybe look into the Vedas and see if they've got it too. And I mean, the Native Americans had it. They do. It's that they have the four cardinal directions. They talk about the same four elements, the prima materia, just not the same words, obviously, but they had the exact same concepts of it. So I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can look at it. Were we taught? It's a possibility, I suppose. A lot of things about humans that don't add up here. But,
yeah.
yeah.
I'll think about it some more, because I think it's just it's like, hey, if you're interested in this and committed and willing to spend time, is it better to study this and incorporate in your life, and that's it, and that's what they're done? Or is it more like, no, this is all somebody else's work, should I go do something on my own? I mean, and
Sure.
is that foolhardy? Like, why would I go spend another whatever 5-10 years doing something on my own, and then just find out like, crap, this is it, I should have focused on this, I just wasted 5 years doing random crap.
Because it would have been your own, though. If you can get to all of this working on your own, then you earned it. But what's just absolutely thrills me is this idea that I've been just pulling on this string for decades, and seeing where it leads to. And you're absolutely right. It all leads back to the same central core of understandings that then you can, you call that the point, the esoteric core, but then you can take this out and go in all kinds of different directions with it. Yeah, I mean, the
Yeah,
ray
I
of
mean, you spent decades. Like, I don't think I have the patience to spend that. Like,
you don't
I mean,
have to, though. You
right.
don't
And
have
I'm
to.
also a lot older, right? I don't have, I might have. I'm hoping to be retired and not have to do this random 9 to 5 bullshit anymore for very long. But even after that, I don't have infinite time. I only have, maybe another 10-15 years, maybe 20 years, maybe 30.
Okay.
Nearly given it 30 years, then I'll be like 80. Like, honestly, old. So
Well, let me put it
what do
this
I put it on?
way. For me personally, I'm just going to come from my own life with this, because I, I've read everything that Gurdjieff and Ouspensky ever wrote, and I had come across the concept of these 7 levels of development over and over and over again, and yet they actually never had any kind of practical value, because I didn't know how to get from 3 to 4, or 2 to 4, or whatever. In my case, 3 to 4, because 1, 2, and 3 are all equal. Okay, but I didn't know how to get there. I needed something outside of it to kind of fill in some of the gaps. And if you go and check out fourth way schools these days, they're doing qigong along with it, and kundalini, and all sorts of things that Gurdjieff would have rolled over in his grave about, because he was very against kundalini, for example, in most cases. But if they do all have a common origin, then you can then go back in time and say, oh, that's where this concept comes from, right? And I now have a much better understanding of what these 7 levels or stages of development actually mean by looking at it from a different perspective.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, sure, right? Put me on an island and never having been exposed to any of this, and there's no way in hell I'd ever come up with any of this. So I agree. We do have to ride on the shoulders of those who have gone before, but not blindly so. Anyway, good stuff.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
All right. Well, if you come up with something, this is an ongoing exploration that just gives me so much joy. Having been involved in this work for so many decades, I feel very blessed that I can encounter things that bring me so much joy, and I discover these sorts of things. And so that's part of what I wanted to impart today as well. It's just that keep it fresh, keep it working, look for
Mhm.
examples, or look for places where the examples don't fit is sometimes more useful.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
Sounds good.
all right. Thank you, my friends. I'll see probably both of you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.